Suffice it to say for our purposes here that the movement that Dom Guéranger began spread across Europe and found its home in the monasteries of the Benedictines and the houses of the Jesuits and other monastics who, for their part, wanted to get as much from the sacred liturgy as was possible. In following the death of Dom Guéranger, from Meredith to Maria Locke under the leadership of Abbot Marmion, to the experimentally ecumenical abbey established by Dom Baudouin, the progressivist liturgical movement became firmly entrenched behind the scenes of Catholic life. Looking merely, however, at the liturgical movement at the onset of the 20th century, without considering the incredible sociological changes that were occurring at the same time, would leave the picture incomplete. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Second Industrial Revolution in the West was yielding to unprecedented changes in civilization. By the tens of thousands, immigrants were crossing oceans to settle in America. In Europe, as well as in the United States, factory work and, in particular, assembly line manufacturing drew vast numbers of people into urban settings. Electricity would quickly become readily available. The automobile would bring a population that had become increasingly mobile through locomotion to people who traveled to wherever it was they could find work. In all of this, the Church, in the person of local bishops and priests, had to figure out how to adjust to the constantly changing social structure in a way that kept the faith alive to Catholics in their charge. It must not have been easy, and certainly one cannot challenge the zeal for the faith and care for souls that must have been uppermost in the minds of those concerned clerics. They were faced with tough questions. What could be done? What must be done in order that the Catholic faith remain alive? How could the faith be spread when the difficulty of taking care of those already in the Church was overwhelming? Tough questions indeed. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between finding a way to make sure the faith remained alive and bringing new members into the flock, innovative ways of thinking led to experimentation, novelty, and unapproved practices of worship. By 1907, when Pope St. Pius X published the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, those he called the partisans of error were firmly entrenched. When the Holy Father warned of those who lay the axe not to the branches and shoots, but to the very root, that is, to the faith and its deepest fibers, about whom do you think he was referring? Clearly, His Holiness was not referring to enemies at the gates, but to those who had long since infiltrated the Church and were spreading their poison from within. But by this time, by 1907, the battle was already lost. It was only a matter of time until the victors would claim their prize. Subsequent to Pope Pius X's motu proprio in 1903, the liturgical movement took root in European monasticism. In 1909, a congress of forward-thinking monastics was held at Mechlin, and in 1910, the first of many liturgical weeks, where parish priests were invited to spend a week at the monastery with the monks, was held at Mount Cesar near Louvain. Here they were inculcated with the agenda of the liturgical movement and the importance of full participation of the faithful in liturgy. Dom Baudouin had been the first to figure out this seminar system of educating parish priests, and the liturgical movement spread quickly across all of Europe and into the United States, finding its home in places such as the Benedictine Abbey at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, which served as its headquarters in this country for the bulk of the 20th century. As the 20th century progressed, the names of the liturgically progressivist leaders are less important than previously because the system that propelled the movement was so firmly entrenched and the agenda so clearly marked out that individual leaders would not impact the movement as they had in the past. There are incidents along the way that are important in the overall scheme of things, such as the numerous occasions when Popes Pius X, Benedict XV, and Pius XI granted indults for various groups to say Mass in the vernacular. St. Pius X had given permission for a sector of Yugoslavia to use the Roman rite in the Palyaslav language. Benedict XV granted use of Croatian, Slovenian, and Paleo-Slav on 5 occasions and in 9 different places. In Germany, a regional version of the Missal was approved for Bavaria, and in 1935, the Vienna ritual for use in all of Austria was approved by Rome. And Christmas Eve 1943 brought from the Sacred Congregation of Rites a decree that a largely vernacular form of the dialogue Mass, which some described as the German High Mass, was declared officially tolerated with the consent of the Holy Father, Pope Pius XII. While it would be unfair to say that it was a common practice, it appears that more requests of that nature were approved than disapproved. In the 1920s, there was a strong current toward interfaith prayer gatherings and conventions that were spawned by the growing and ever more powerful, actually by then the most powerful part of the movement, the progressivist faction. As a response, on January 26, 1928, Pope Pius XI published Mortalium Animos in an effort to bring a halt to the practice he said was doomed to fail because it betrayed the Catholic faith. We turn our attention now to the period following the Second World War, that which immediately preceded the Second Vatican Council. By the end of the Second World War, the liturgical movement was so firmly entrenched throughout the Latin Rite of the Church that it can fairly be said to have been pervasive. Nor was it underground, although the faithful in the pew were clueless because the liturgy was not something with which they had any reason to be concerned. The Mass was the Mass. It was, as the Catechism described, one throughout the world. It was a clear sign of the mark of the Church, the oneness of the Latin liturgy. However, in order that we might understand just how far the liturgical progressivists had traversed, consider this book, The Mass of the Future. First, think for a moment about that title, The Mass of the Future. Considering that there had been one Mass in the Roman Rite for almost 2,000 years, how could there be a Mass of the future? And who could have thought there was going to be in 1948 when this book was published? The author, Jesuit Gerald Ellard, was a mover and shaker within the liturgical movement. And this book, his second on the subject, provides a summary of the activities that led to the advanced position of the movement at the end of the Second World War. And it foretold in a remarkable way the direction the movement would be taking. Well, let's take a look at what the Mass of the Future looked like in 1948. As far as Ellard was concerned, that there was going to be a new Mass was a given. When developing his prognostications as to what the Mass of the future would look like, he focuses on almost a dozen specifics. First, the title of the chapter addressed to this issue is Wanted, Name for the New Mass. He proposes, if Holy Mass is to become a social function in which all share organically, or rather, let us say, before Holy Mass can occupy that position, it demands some modernization in popular terminology. At present, it suffers the needless handicap of an archaic nomenclature. And for those who don't speak liturgies, that means that the name of the Mass has to be replaced. After a couple of pages in which he proposes that the faithful in the pew do not understand the concept anyway, he proposes a suggestion that the term sacrifice be given a 10-year moratorium, and that in the interval, this sacred action be described and spoken of as Holy Mass, the perfect profession of love.